But anyway, Wen Tisung, who is obviously Chinese and who clearly speaks, and obviously speaks Mandarin, he gave a explanation of Chinese rhetoric and of the various different stages at which Chinese rhetoric takes place. And he said, I'm going to just pass some of his points. He says that Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson's recent words, China will act strongly to resolutely respond and take countermeasures. Many people then, many observers, and we mean what we say, and then many observers took the Chinese use of the words forceful response to mean war. But this person, Wen Tisung, goes on to say that forceful or effective can mean war, but not. It doesn't actually suggest that in Mandarin, and that in fact it stops short of threatening war, and that other expressions like "you are standing on the edge of a cliff," which is also being used, also suggests that we're not quite yet at a stage when the Chinese actually are threatening military action. But then this person, Wen Tisung, says what would be the kind of Chinese expressions that would cause serious alarm. And he mentions this one: if we could put up with this, what else can't we put up with? If the Chinese start using that phrase, if we could put up with this, in this case Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, what else can't we put up with? And then this person goes on, Wen Tisung goes on to say, this means the perceived provocation from others not only threatens China's interests, but threatens its identity too. The rhetoric invokes the familiar century of humiliation, that's to say that period from the mid-1840s until the 1940s, when China became subjected to a series of aggressive wars by the Western powers, including Russia, by the way, and Japan. So that's the period that the Chinese refer to as the century of humiliation. So if we could put up with this, what else can't we put up with? That would suggest to the Chinese, that would remind the Chinese of the century of humiliation and Chinese nationalism rhetoric, narratives, and would signal that China has no room to back down. And it shows a readiness to use very high-level brinkmanship. And this person points out that China used this language before skirmishes with India in 1962 and with Vietnam in 1979. But then there is a further stage beyond this phrase, if we could put up with this, what else can't we put up with? And the final, the toughest language that China uses before military action is taken is, don't say we didn't warn you. In other words, the last warning. And again, this person, Wen Tisung, says that the Chinese use precisely this kind of language before actual fighting took place with India in 1962, with Vietnam in 1979, and importantly with the Soviet Union in the late 1960s, when there were border clashes between China and the Soviets in the 1960s. Now, can I just make an observation about those border clashes in the late 1960s, the Soviet-Chinese border clashes? What people perhaps overlook about those border clashes is that they were a direct clash between the armed forces of two nuclear powers. In the late 1960s, the Soviet Union was a global nuclear superpower with military forces at that time, which was seen by many people as being comparable in scale and power to those of the United States. So the Chinese in the late 1960s, knowing of this enormous military power that the Soviets had at their disposal, but nonetheless China did already possess nuclear weapons of its own, though in a only to a very limited extent, nowhere near comparable to that of the enormous Soviet nuclear arsenal of that period. Nonetheless, the Chinese were prepared to make that kind of statement. Don't say we didn't warn you to the Soviets over disputes over the border. And the Chinese were also prepared to engage in border clashes with the Soviet military, some of which, by the way, spilled over onto Soviet territory. Now, these border clashes caused massive alarm at the time, both globally. I mean, as you can imagine, these were clashes between two nuclear powers, one of which was a nuclear superpower. There were fears that the Soviets would retaliate with nuclear weapons. And in fact, there's even a story that has been circulated by Henry Kissinger, which the Russians continue to deny, by the way, that the Soviets actually were prepared to launch nuclear strikes against China, and that they pulled back from doing so when the United States informed them that it would be opposed to such a move. But that gives you some idea of the scale of the crisis in the late 1960s between the Soviets and the Chinese. Now, that puts that crisis of the late 1960s at a fairly similar level to the one that we're seeing between China and the United States today. Except, of course, that China is militarily far more powerful than it was in the late 1960s. It's more militarily powerful today than it was then. It has much bigger conventional armed forces than Russia does. So obviously the military balance between China and Russia is completely different from what it was in the late 1960s. It's also very different, obviously, from what it was with the United States, what it would have been in the 1960s with the United States. So the Chinese in the late 1960s were prepared to take risks, engage a nuclear superpower in a military confrontation. At that point, it was the Soviet Union over something that they considered important to themselves. And we shouldn't assume that now that they're in a much stronger position, they wouldn't be prepared to do the same with another nuclear superpower, which in this case, of course, is the United States. Now, I just want to add something else, which is that, of course, that confrontation between the Soviet Union and China in the late 1960s had immense geopolitical consequences. Firstly, it forced both the Soviet Union and China to seek rapprochements with the United States. The Soviets through the process known as détente, the Chinese through the opening up with the United States, which led to Richard Nixon's visit to China in 1972. So you can see that it led to a major superpower realignment. But it was also, in my opinion, the single most important event in the crisis that eventually weakened the Soviet Union, because the Soviets, after those border clashes, understood that they were facing a two-front war, and they had to reinforce their armed forces to a huge extent in the Far East, which put an enormous strain both on their military and their economic system. Up to that point, the Soviets had been able to concentrate the bulk of their military against NATO in Europe. Now they were in a two-front war, and eventually they buckled. Now, it seems to me that the United States is running something like the same risks as the Soviets did back in the 60s. They refused to give. By the way, the border clashes between the Chinese and the Russians of the 1960s have now been completely resolved. That issue of the border has now been settled. So negotiations did eventually take place between the Chinese and the Russians. And that issue that led to those border clashes has now disappeared. And had the Soviets perhaps shown more sense and goodwill in the 1960s over that issue of the border, if they'd been prepared to do in the 1960s what they eventually did in the 1980s and 1990s, they might have saved themselves from that two-front situation. Well, it seems to me that the United States, by taking the same unbending line, is risking that same two-front crisis that the Soviets did back in the 1960s and which caused the Soviets to buckle. Now, let's go back to the points that Wen Tae-sung has said about what would be the toughest rhetoric that the Chinese could use. And he says that the penultimate point when Chinese rhetoric becomes toughest is when they say, if we could put up with this, what else can't we put up with? And then the final warning is, don't say we didn't warn you. Now, I am not an expert on Chinese rhetoric, but Wen Tae-sung does appear to be. And I've just gone to an article in Global Times, and I read that Leng Bo, in this article, a person called Leng Bo, who Global Times says is an expert from the Institute of Taiwan Studies in the Chinese Academy of Sciences, discussing China's response and saying that there will be a military response to the provocation of Nancy Pelosi's visit. He's quoted by Global Times, which, remember, is the English language newspaper published by the People's Daily, the official newspaper of Chinese Communist Party. Leng Bo is quoted as saying, China was not strong enough during the Taiwan crisis in 1995-96. That's the moment when the United States previously sent an aircraft carrier towards Taiwan, and the Chinese were forced to back down. But then Leng Bo says China was not strong enough during the Taiwan Straits crisis in 1995-96, but didn't hesitate to take a military response. The answer for the current situation is clear, considering its current political and economic strength. And then there's a series of dots after that comment, but which suggests that Leng Bo had some other things to say, but Global Times, the editors of Global Times, decided that they wouldn't publish them, and one wonders why. But then they finish quoting his comments, and we see that Leng Bo finished his comments by saying, if this can be tolerated, what cannot? Let's go back to what Wen Tae-sung says is the penultimate warning, words of the Chinese, that the Chinese would use. If we could put up with this, what else can't we put up with? In other words, Leng Bo is now being published by Global Times as using essentially the same words. If this can be tolerated, what cannot. And then we go to the title of this article. And it's an article published by Global Times, and it's Global Times staff reporters. In other words, Global Times' editorial team and its staff reporters. And the title of this article, in which Leng Bo is quoted using those words, "If we can tolerate this, what can't be tolerated," is, the title is, "Don't say we didn't warn you." And let's go back to Wen Tin-sung, the top gear, the absolute penultimate warning words are, "Don't say we didn't warn you." Now, one has to qualify all of this, because these words, if we tolerate this, what cannot be tolerated, and the title, the headline of this article, "Don't say we didn't warn you," they're not being uttered by the Chinese government. They're appearing in a semi-official newspaper, but one which is very close to the Chinese government and which is in effect its unofficial voice. But nonetheless, there is some distance. And the headline also qualifies the warning contained in those words. "Don't say we didn't warn you." It's attributed, and it's attributed in the headline, not in the body of the article, to a symposium of China's top think tank. This is the Institute of Taiwan Studies that Leng Bo belongs to. And it says the symposium of China's top think tank sends classic pre-war warning to provocative Pelosi. Now, this Institute of Taiwan Studies is obviously going to be very tightly controlled by the Chinese government. So we can be sure that its people like Leng Bo, are being given the green light to talk in this way. And there's clearly been a positive decision to allow Global Times to publish these warnings. If we tolerate this, what else will we tolerate? That's stage one. Don't say we didn't warn you. That is the ultimate warning. So I can't help but think that though the Chinese government is giving itself some room, some space for maneuver, it's deliberately using this NGO, this government-controlled, Chinese government-controlled NGO, and this very important newspaper to give some very, very powerful warnings to the United States. And these military units that have been assembled by China, of course, are there to reinforce those warnings. Now, I still think that we're not quite there yet. As I said, it's not Chinese officials so far who are talking in this way. They've done it a step further. But they are using this very powerful rhetoric. I would say that I'm very interested to know who Mr. Wen Tin-sung is and how it has come about that he's just published this very revealing comment explaining to us the hierarchy of warnings that China uses in a thread on Moon of Alabama. Perhaps that's not entirely coincidence that those warnings have appeared on a widely read, on a thread on a widely read blog just before these warnings appear in Global Times. One way or the other, this is looking like a very alarming situation indeed. I think Washington would be wise to heed these warnings. If the United States persists with what the Chinese see as provocations over Taiwan, well, as I said yesterday, all the indications are that the Chinese are now cranking up towards some kind of direct, kinetic military response. They showed back in the 1960s that when China is pushed, it's prepared to take on a nuclear superpower. In that case, it was the Soviet Union. Let's not make the mistake of thinking that they might not do the same this time with the United States. And even if that military conflict, that military clash is contained, as the one with the Soviets in the 1960s was contained, it had long-term effects which were disastrous for the Soviets, and a clash with China over Taiwan would, in my opinion, be similarly disastrous for the United States now. Anyway.